Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the History Valley podcast. And today I'm joined by Dr. Dennis MacDonald. And today's discussion is based on his upcoming book, How Homer Solved the Synoptic Problem, Excavating for Homeric Mimmesis in a Lost Gospel Q+. And with that being said, Dennis, thank you very much for joining me today.
Oh, it's a pleasure as always, Jacob. Thank you.
I think it's important to recap on what exactly the Q plus Papias hypothesis is before we delve into the book. And just real quick before you respond to that, Chris X, thank you for becoming a member. Appreciate it. Go ahead, Dennis.
Actually, I want to back up a little further. What is the synoptic problem? The synoptic problem is the intertextual relationships between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And scholars have been fussing with that question for almost 2 millennia without a solution. And the reason that we don't have a solution is that we don't have it. Think of it as a jigsaw puzzle. We have a lot of pieces missing and no picture of the whole. So scholars are moving the tiles around the table, trying to put together the most reasonable connection. I'm sorry, arguing that, say, Matthew is earlier or Mark is earlier. And then there's a question of, do we have a lost source? Do we have multiple lost sources? Oh, excuse me. That has not been solved, in my opinion, because people have ignored the influence of the Homeric epics. And once one sees how Homer influences those texts, one sees not only the proper sequence for them, but you get a better idea of what the lost gospel is. There was one lost gospel. It was called Q, the German word Quelle, at least by modern scholars. But the title of it originally probably was the Logoi, or the sayings of Jesus. The Q plus Papias hypothesis treasures the information, even though it was wrong, by Papias of Hierapolis, who had his own synoptic problem. His problem was he had one Gospel of Mark that he thought was transcribing the things from Peter, and 2 Gospels of Matthew in Greek. And he and John the Elder thought, well, there must have been a Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, and 2 inept Greek translators translated it, and so that's why you have 2 Greek Matthews, and that's why Papias, and he says so, wants to get them all in the correct order. He wants to put it in the Matthean order, and he's consulted people about oral traditions that they have from the elders and so on. And he wrote a 5-volume work trying to meld these sources together. In other words, Papias wrote the oldest of the Gospels. And he wrote it in the synoptic tradition, and he wrote it earlier than Luke. Luke knew the document written by Papias, and he was sometimes fond of it and sometimes not. And that's a different story. So that's the synoptic problem. The Q plus Papias solution is this, that Mark is the earliest surviving gospel, and it was paraphrased or redacted by Matthew and Luke independently. But Matthew and Luke also have content that they share against Matthew, and in some cases, Matthew is more primitive, and in other cases, Luke is more primitive. So when you have oscillating priority, you can say, well, Luke and Matthew must have gotten that from Logoi, or the Q document. And I never talk about the Q document as Q. It's always the logo of Jesus, or sometimes I refer to it as Papias's lost Matthew, because that's what Logoi was. It was the lost Matthew that Papias talks about. Now, when you bring Homer into the picture, the jigsaw puzzle changes. Now you know how the pieces fit together, which is earlier, which is later, because now you have a picture of the puzzle. And now you have a better idea of what that lost gospel looked like. And here's the kicker, Jacob, and I don't know if I've ever told you this. The Q document has its own Homeric imitation, and it does so 7 times. But even though it's a Jewish document, it's not a Christian document. And even though the primary intertexts are Jewish texts, that's clear, it also uses Homer to create narrative. And that was a wonderful discovery for me. And so that's what the book is about. It's about excavating from the most recent of the Synoptic Gospels, that is Luke and Acts, down to Papias and his problem, then to Matthew, then to Mark, then to the Q document, and then to show that the Q document already is imitating Homer in a brilliant way. The very end of the book is like a report of an excavation, where I try to write a history of the Synoptic tradition that goes from the beginning of the tradition, that is the Logoi of Jesus, including its Homeric imitations, and taking it all the way to Luke Acts. And then I also have a section occasionally on John, how John is using the Synoptics for its own purposes. So that's an overview, but the Synoptic problem is the unsolved problem of the relationship of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And it should have been solved a long time ago. The reason it wasn't is people were intentionally ignoring Homer. And when you bring Homer into the conversation, your jigsaw puzzle changes.
Now I would like you to delve deeper into the Homeric connections with the Gospels and how the Homeric epics solve the Synoptic problem. What are the examples of the Gospels deriving material from Homer that closes the gap?
In order to put a context for that, I need to say just a little bit about ancient intertextuality. There were 3 primary ways that the ancients talked about how to use earlier texts. One was paraphrassis, where we get the word paraphrase. That's where you're simply redacting or editing a text that is on the same topic. At the other extreme is genre, where 2 texts are similar to each other because they share a literary genre. But for the ancients, the most important project was in the middle. It's called Mimmesis, or imitation, where we get the word mimic. And that's where author creatively reuses an antecedent text that's on a different topic, but he can create, and it's usually men, an alternative narrative, often for shaping a new identity for his audience or for his community, as is the case in religious groups. And mimesis involves 3 things. You choose a model that is compelling and is going to be known by your more sophisticated readers. Then you create similarities between that story and the one you're writing, so the reader knows that there's an affinity. And then at the end, you twist it so that you have a syncresis, that you have a comparison of one story with another to show that the story you're writing is more adventuresome, more beautiful, funnier, or in religious groups, more satisfying in terms of the hero's qualities, wisdom, compassion, courage, and so on. So this is what mimesis is about, and that's why Homer is so important. People, early Christians, are not paraphrasing Homer. And they're usually not doing the same kind of genre composition. They are trying to compete with Homer, largely because Virgil's already done so in the Aeneid. And Christian authors are interested in identifying how their heroes, especially Jesus, but also Paul or John or whatever, are better heroes for the community. And it helps to shape their social identity, especially after the Jewish War.
I'll take this super chat real quick. Israelite Christianity, thank you for your super chat. How would you refute the claim that all reconstructions of hypothetical sources, including your reconstruction of the logoi of Jesus, are too speculative and subjective and solve no textual issues? So I think what's going on with this super chat is, I think this person confused a response I wrote with your position at the same time, because I didn't reconstruct anything of a logoi of Jesus. You have your own reconstruction of the logoi of Jesus. I don't know what's going on here. I'm confused.
No, I do. And I think it's a wonderful question.
Mm-hmm.
And I welcome it. Yes, when you don't have sources for a text, a reconstruction of it is hypothetical. And that's true for ancient Greek texts. It's true for Nag Hammadi texts. It's true for Dead Sea Scroll texts. You have to have hypothetical models and criteria for reconstructing these texts if you want to. The point is, though, that hypothetical reconstructions are not arbitrary. They're not entirely subjective. They are based on criteria that can be scientific criteria. Now, yes, I wish we could find copies of the Q document. We know that it existed. We also know some of the things that must have been there because you have radiation from those things that are felt in later texts. So the scholar's work is a hypothetical but scientific investigation into how you explain the content of a lost document. And it is hypothetical, but it's not subjective. And it's worth doing, especially if the synoptic problem is still unsolved. I'm not accusing you of this, but many people, including scholars, are too lazy to work with the Q document. It is hard work. And by the way, reconstructing the Q document is not a theological task. It's not an ideological task. It's not a historical task. It's a philological task. And so when one tries to reconstruct ancient texts, and I've done so with a number of different texts, not just Q, you have to be careful about what criteria you use, and you have to realize that it's not rock-ribbed because you don't have the physical evidence you wish you did. But then the issue is, whose hypothetical reconstruction is most compelling? Which one is most solid? And that's the discussion we need to have. Now, I say in every time I reconstruct, I publish the reconstruction of the Q document, which sometimes shapes because my criteria change, but not by much. But I admit that it's hypothetical. And then I say, and my hypothesis is stronger than anybody else's, and we know that there was a lost text. So please, if you can help me and have better criteria for reconstructing the text, no one would be happier than I.
And I will say this, that just real quick before we move on, that because I felt like, because I know that part of that super chat was addressing a response to a comment, but that I can have somebody on and disagree about a certain position while agreeing with something else that they're talking about. That's not a big deal. And I don't typically interject my opinions in videos like this, as everybody, most people that watch my channel know. So that's how I work. respectful agreement, respectful disagreement. There's no issue there. That being said, Dennis, can you talk about some of the unique parallels that we covered before between Matthew and especially Luke's unique material with Homer?
Well, Luke's unique material is all over the Acts of the Apostles. And people need to take the book of Acts seriously as a part of the Synoptic tradition. And from the beginning to end, the author is imitating not only Homer, but Euripides, Plato, at least in one place, probably Aeschylus. Certainly Euripides' Bacchae plays a role. The author is absolutely brilliant. And there's almost nothing historical in the Acts of the Apostles because the author is so overwhelmed with the challenge of having a founding myth that rivals Virgil's Aeneid, because Virgil has already imitated many of those same texts in order to tout the early empire under Augustus. And Luke won't have any of it. He wants to have a rival myth. It is not a history, I'm sorry to say. I wish it were, because then we'd be able to be more confident about what happened with the early Christian movement. But that's not what the Acts of the Apostles is about. Now, the Gospel of Luke does have its own imitations of Greek literature. And the most obvious one is the infancy announcements at the beginning of Luke that's based on the conception of Aeneas, the hero of the Aeneid. And scholars have not seen that. And there the parallels are overwhelming. And people have not seen it. So that would be one wonderful example. Also, at the very end of the Gospel of Luke, you have an alternative story about Jesus revealing himself by his wounds to two people who are walking to the village of Emmaus. And this is the end of the Odyssey. The Odyssey has Odysseus come home and come to his father and reveal his wound to demonstrate that he actually has come home safely. And the parallels are really quite striking. There are other parallels that have happened throughout Luke that are also original. One is Tantalus in Hades, who wants to have water given to his mouth. You know, ancient readers would know that that's Tantalus. And in Tartarus, who can't get a drink of water. And so on. So it goes on. It is so wonderful and playful and brilliant. Things don't have to be historically true to be important. They can be important because they're artistic and they're creative and they are sustaining an identity for the readership. And that's what's going on in Luke Acts. And Homer's all over the place in the Acts of the Apostles.
I would now like to shift to Mark's use of Euripides and Matthew's paraphrasis.
I own in the book Homeric, How Homer Solved the Synoptic Problem, I only deal with one Euripides example, and that's the madness of Heracles. And the analogy for that is the curing of the frothing demoniac in Mark. And I don't know, Jacob, if you want me to go through all the details. They really is quite detailed.
You can.
But the most important part of your question is that the telltale signs that you have between Mark and the madness of Heracles do not appear in Matthew. Matthew either did not know that Mark was imitating the madness of Heracles, or he didn't want the reader to know, so that to make it a historical event. And I actually think it's probably the former. I don't think Matthew was astute about what Mark was trying to accomplish. But so, for example, there's a young man who is frothing at the mouth. He's convulsed. He's been pestered by Hera since his birth. Jesus exorcises him, and people think he's dead, but he's alive, comes back to life. And it shows that Jesus is a lot nicer deity than Hera is. And in fact, Euripides scolds Hera really at the end of the play to say, who's going to worship a god like that? And so Mark is trying to say, we've got a god for you, that is Jesus, the Son of God, if you will. And that's someone to venerate and to worship, but forget about Hera.
So now I'd like to ask you about the connection between the logoi of Jesus and the logoi of Tobit.
That's a very good way to put it, because the title of the book of Tobit is Book of Logoi of Tobit. And the Lost Gospel is the logoi of Jesus. Now, I think that's probably an accident, but what we can say is that Tobit, probably written relatively early in the 2nd century BCE, was imitating the Odyssey, books 1 and 2 especially, but also book 4 and 16, about Telemachus. Telemachus is a young man, Odysseus' son, who becomes a hero himself. And this, the Germans call this a Bildungsroman. That is, it's a story about the coming of age of a youngster, mostly young men. And they have to endure challenges. They have to show courage. They sometimes win a spouse, which is the case of Tobit with Sarah. And the parallels are just remarkable between Tobit and the Odyssey. Now, think of it. This is early 2nd century BCE Jewish author who is Torah observant and is in exile and is hoping for the restoration of the Jerusalem temple. He's a pious Jew, and he evokes biblical texts, but the text he evokes most is through Mimmesis of the Odyssey. So that then is, I'll jump ahead, Jacob, to talk about the beginning of the Q document. The Q document begins with a Bildungsroman. The young Jesus is chosen by God to be his son. And the very first thing he has to face is temptations from the devil. And that includes an invitation to the authority over all the kingdoms of the world. If Jesus would kowtow to the devil, and Jesus says no. Then Jesus goes to his hometown, Nazareth, and he's hoping that he gets some support from them. And they don't give him any support. They just wonder, where did this guy get all of his wisdom and how cocky is he? And then after that, Jesus gets his first disciples. In the Q document, they are simply volunteers, but in the Gospel of Mark, they're fishermen. Well, that's what happens in the Iliad. Telemachus he finds out that he really is Odysseus' son. He's got to do something about it. So he tries to kick out the suitors, and it's a challenge about authority over the house. And the suitors aren't about to leave. So what does Telemachus do? He pulls together a council, and he asks the council to help him get rid of the suitors. And they said, nothing doing. So Athena says, okay, we've got to go to plan B. And now we're going to I'll get you a ship and a crew so you can sail to Pylos to find about your father. Now those parallels, Jacob, are astonishing. And they both have to do with, so we have three stories of youngsters coming into age with a similar resume. The first one is Telemachus. The next one is Tobias in the book of Tobit, where he comes to manhood, and then Jesus in the Q document. Now the other gospels come along and they like that, except for John. But the other gospel authors like that because then they can talk about how Jesus gets this authority and how he can oppose other Jewish teachers and so on. So it's just a remarkable thing. And I've only found that in the last couple of years that I played around for 25 years with the Q document, and it never occurred to me that there was Homeric background there. And in this case, though, Jacob, it's not a matter of mimesis of Tobit. The issue is genre, that we have the Bildungsroman genre, and the best model for that, and by the way, the classicists say this, the best model for the growth of a character in antiquity, and the oldest one, was the Bildungsroman of Telemachus. Then we find it in the book of Tobit for a Jewish hero who comes to age. And then we find it in the Christian version with Jesus's early career.
So the next thing I'd like to ask you about is the Logos, Homeric Mimmesis, and Jesus' empowerment.
Okay. I thought I just treated that, Jacob. The empowerment comes that
Yeah.
John, sorry.
I'll just ask a different one.
Yeah, I'm going to suggest one for you to ask. May I do that? I think the center of the book that I'm trying to market now is the Homeric imitations in Mark, where surprisingly you find insertions that come from the Q document. And most reconstructions of Q ignore Mark. They're interested in Matthew and Luke using the Q document. Mark is using it first, and Mark is using it in very sophisticated ways. It's just hard to see it. But once you compare various passages in Mark with Homer, all of a sudden, you see that there are the pieces of the Jesus tradition stuck in there, and they probably come from the Q document, and not just because of my criteria, but also for the ones that are there for the two document hypothesis. Now, how did they get in there? They got in there because there was a lost document that that Mark knew in addition to Matthew and Luke. And that is revolutionary honestly, Jacob, in the quest for the Q document, because for the most part, Mark has been ignored. And I think Mark is perhaps the most important witness to the existence of the Q document, even if it's not the most important for the reconstruction of the text as a whole.
All right, so here's what happened. I read the wrong thing, so that's why that's what happened earlier. I meant to ask you about Papias' expositions of the logia. So when you get into the different stratums, you label that as the fourth stratum. What do we know about Papias's content? What little do we know about that? About Papias's expositions of the Lord?
It's a 5-volume work, esteemed by Luke. And by the way, it had a history of transmission in the Armenian world, probably to the 13th century. So it was available. We also know that Jerome and Eusebius had copies of it in the 4th century. Now, why in the world, if they knew of a gospel in the 4th century that was 5 volumes long and had talked about some of the earlier gospels, did they not want to write it? Well, Eusebius says he's a man of very puny intellect. Well, that's probably true. At least he wasn't well educated. But it takes muscle to write a 5-volume work. Jerome didn't like it, and he thought it wasn't worth his effort to translate into Latin, but he certainly had copies, or at least a copy of it, that he could have translated. So we know that it had some legs, more legs than the Q document did. And so with the earlier question, we have a problem in reconstructing Papias too. And there are a number of indicators that are important. So for example, Eusebius says that Papias had a story in it of Jesus forgiving a sinful woman. That's a pericope adulterae, probably. But he didn't know it from Matthew. He didn't know it from Mark. Luke hadn't been written yet. So where did he know this the story of Jesus forgiving a sinful woman? He likely saw it in the Q document. Or another example is that Luke knows the preface of Papias and uses some of the same characters that you have in Papias in the Acts of the Apostles. And the death of Judas in Papias is a combination of motifs that you get from Matthew's statement about Judas's suicide and Papias's alternative that he survived suicide and God struck him down for a smelly and painful death. So I think Papias and John the Elder, in my view, wanted to say that these two documents were written by inept Greek translators because they didn't like either one of them. And they faulted both of them. And in one case, Papias thought the Logoi of Jesus was pretty cool because he has Jesus forgiving a sinful woman. On the other hand, he doesn't like the other Greek translation because it vindicates Judas at the end because he's contrite and takes his own life. So those are some of the best examples I know. Now, here's the big point of question. Eusebius says very clearly that throughout Papias's work, he cites repeatedly the traditions of John the Elder and the interpretations of the Logoi of Jesus. So this Aristion wrote a book called Expositions of the Logoi of the Lord. I think that may have been a commentary on the Q document. There's no way of knowing. But what we can say is that there's nothing in what we have now that survives of Papias that we could say are tagged to the traditions by John the Elder or Aristion. So that was removed. They did not want to have that stuff in there. Now there's one passage where there may be a difference, and other scholars have suggested more tepidly some others. There's a passage about the Last Supper in which Jesus is foretelling the productivity of the earth after Jesus returns. This information that we have in Papias has parallels in Second Baruch, and it's the choice, the interest in having, after the Jewish war, having the temple restored, but also having nature being robust, so that a vine can offer 10,000 bunches of grapes and so on. That could be for something from John the Elder, but we don't know. I doubt if it was from Aristion, because Aristion was interested in the logoi, in the teachings, presumably, which is more likely Q.
And can you tell us a bit about the death of Judas?
Well,
first of all, Papias and Acts. You know.
Okay, let's get a running start on it. Judas is never mentioned by Paul. Judas is never mentioned in Q. Judas appears, although the name Judas appears probably at the end of the list of the 12, but it's not Judas Iscariot, it's Judas, son of Jacob. Mark is the first person to create the word Iscariot, and it comes from the Greek word is, into, and Kirioth, which is Aramaic for village, into the village. Well, his model in Homer is first seen in the epic as Melanthius, who's driving goats into the city. I don't think that's by accident. Now, Mark gives, he's the one who creates Judas, the traitor. And he says that he's going to get his comeuppance. But he doesn't indicate that Judas is going to commit suicide or how he's going to die, just that he's going to have his comeuppance. Matthew comes along and he reads Mark, and he says, oh, we've got to take care of this, because Jesus promised 12 thrones to the 12 disciples, and now Judas is dead, and who's going to fill those 12 thrones? The promise of 12 thrones comes from Q. And in Q, the disciples are always faithful, all the way to the end, so they merit these these thrones. So Matthew says, I've got to figure this out. So how can I restore Matthew to a throne that Jesus promised him? And so he creates this business about the silver payment that came to Judas, and he gives it to the high priest, and he says, this is blood money, you take it. And they're not going to take it. They're going to create a field. And so Judas kills himself in remorse, as though that would be good enough. Well, Papias's readers come, and probably Papias himself take a look at that and say, that is stupid. What, you commit suicide, and then you can join the 12 and sit on a throne? No. We've got to take care of that. So It's possible that Papias already had talked about a Justus Barsabbas as the one to replace Judas. Luke knows about the replacement and the death of Judas, but he chooses Matthias instead of Barsabbas Justus. And I don't know why. I have some suspicions, but that's the off the charts hypothetical. So that's the history of the death of Judas. And I don't know what more to say, but that's the history of his death.
So when you look at the different strata of the logoi, also in parallel with the Homeric imitation strata going through traveling through the synoptics, what is going on there, like in general, in terms of how does it fully close the gap on the synoptic problem? In other words, how much material from Mark and Luke, especially looking at Luke's unique, especially looking at some of Luke's unique material, came from Homer?
Relatively little Homeric stuff is in the Logoi of Jesus. The author is more interested in Jewish texts, especially Deuteronomy, to show that Jesus is superior to Moses. But there's another section of the Logoi of Jesus that has been overlooked and I haven't mentioned yet. We know that in the Synoptics, one of its favorite literary tropes is the master-slave relationship. So that this is a perfect model for expressing the absence of Jesus after his death and his return at some time to reward the faithful servants and to punish those who are not faithful. And there are 5 of them in the Synoptics, and 3 of them come out of the Q document. And the people have tried to say, well, maybe this really is related to the economics of Palestine during hard times. And they are aware of these issues of how slaves and masters relate to each other. And then it became apocalypticized by saying that, and that's very similar to Jesus being gone for quite a while, coming back unexpectedly, rewarding the faithful and punishing the wicked. And we find that at several places. So in the way that usually happens is there's a master who has to go to a wedding, or he has to be gone on a journey for a long time. And so what he does is he has to give his slaves responsibilities about taking care of the household, who's going to feed whom, how you're going to protect the family, and so on. But they have to be ready because they don't know when the master is going to return. And if they've been faithful in this way, when the master returns, he's going to treat them well. If they don't, in one of the stories, and it's in the Q document, in every reconstruction of Q, he's going to dismember the unfaithful slave who's drinking with the wicked, and he's not taking care of other slaves. What happens in the Odyssey? Odysseus goes off to the Trojan War. He puts his slaves in charge, and they have to take care of the responsibilities. During his absence, suitors want to marry Penelope and are drinking, and Melanthius is a wicked slave, and he provides them goats for their feasting. Well, Odysseus finally comes back after 20 years, and the suitors think he must be dead by now, either at Troy or at sea. Penelope thinks he's probably dead. His father Laertes probably so. Athena says no, he's going to come back to Telemachus. But so he comes back unexpectedly and in secrecy, and he tests to see who's been faithful and who has not. And he rewards the faithful, and he dismembers Melanthius. He cuts him up. And so this becomes then a metaphor for Jesus's absence. He entrusts the message to his followers. In his absence, they have to remain faithful, even to death. They do not know the day or hour that he's going to return. But when he does, he's going to reward the faithful, as already in the Logoi of Jesus, with the 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel, which would be an earthly issue. And then he's going to punish the wicked. And that's anticipated already at the beginning of the Q document, where John the Baptist says, who taught you to flee the wrath that's to come? Already one stronger than I is coming, and his pitchfork is in his hands. And he's going to put the righteous into the barn, and he's going to burn the rest with unquenchable fire. Well, that's what Odysseus does when he comes back, right? He punishes the wicked, all the suitors, including Melanthius, and he rewards the others. So the parallels go on and on. And these are not simply from genre issues. They are mimesis. And it's a way of early Christians, in the case of the Gospels. By the way, the Q document was not written by a Christian. It was written by a Jew. But a Jew who was a radical Jew against the temple and against the Torah. That's one reason Christians liked it, because they had a common enemy, but they didn't have a common hero in quite the same way. Christians wanted a Christ, and the Q document wanted a prophet.
And in my final question, what do you want? What do you hope people take away from when it comes out and they look at the Homeric imitations in the Gospels and how it solves the synoptic problem? What do you hope readers will take away from that?
That is a brilliant question, and I have two answers for you. One is for Christian believers, and the other is for scholars. For Christian believers, it is to tell them the Gospels are not history, and they differ more than they agree. And that what they're trying to do is to create founding myths that make sense for their readers who are facing difficult and different social situations. That's why I wrote the book, Feuding Gospel Authors, to make that available. And I actually wrote it for adult Sunday schools. So even though I'm an atheist, I think this is a useful way of understanding. So Homer is there to remind Christians that their Gospels are not history. They're crafted literature for founding myths for emerging religious groups that are carving their identity over against the great mythologies of Greece and Rome. So that's for the believer. For the scholar, and I probably would be tempted to use curse words, but I'm really angry that people have dismissed Mimmesis criticism out of hand. And I think it is unconscionable and anti-intellectual to say that Mimmesis criticism is wrong. And the primary reason I wrote in my book is to make the case for Homeric imitation absolutely rock solid, and to say that that's one reason the synoptic problem has not been solved. And your ignorance of Homer is tragic for the study of the New Testament, especially the Gospels, or maybe exclusively the Gospels. And this is my last book. I turned 80 in 2 months. And I want to play more banjo and spend more time with grandchildren. So I'm tired of this project myself. But and I think there's scholarly jealousy involved with this, Jacob, in my view. There is a circling of the wagons in the guild. They don't want to acknowledge that they've been wrong for so long. The study of Homer is not easy. Homeric Greek is difficult. Mastering Greek mythology is hard. I'm proud that I was able to do it. I had a wonderful education thanks to grants and so on, and I'm trying to make good on it. But the way that I've been treated, I think, is a scandal. And this is true for publishers. It's been true for, it's been true for my doctoral students who can't get jobs because they're being tarred with my, their feathers are being tarred by my tar. And fortunately, there are a few who are out there, but so I'm tired of it and I'm angry about it. And this book is really issued out of anger.
And I just want to remind everybody real quick, as usual, I do have the links to Dennis's books and website in the description below. It will also be in the pinned comment. When his latest book comes out on how Homer solves the synoptic problem, I will add that in addition in the description below in the pinned comment. And with that being said, Dennis, thank you very much for joining me today.
Well, thank you, Jacob. It's a pleasure.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and/or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.